On the morning of the 2nd of September in the year 31 before our era, in a narrow strait between two headlands on the western coast of Greece, roughly 600 warships, the largest single fleet ever assembled in the ancient Mediterranean, moved slowly out from opposite shores of a shallow blue gulf and, by mid-afternoon, had decided the ownership of the Roman Empire. On one side lay the fleet of Mark Antony and the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra. On the other, the fleet of a 28-year-old Roman politician named Octavian, commanded, in practice, by a general nobody at the time thought of as legendary, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. By the end of that afternoon, 60 ships had broken through the Roman line and were sailing south, out into the open Ionian Sea, with the following wind. The lead ship carried Cleopatra. Antony, on a small 5-oared boat, was chasing after her. The eastern half of the Mediterranean, and with it the last independent kingdom of the Greek world, was falling. And the Roman Republic, 480 years old, born on the day the Tarquins were expelled from Rome, was falling with it. This is the story of the 6 hours off Actium. And of what happened, in Alexandria, in the 11 months that followed, the death of a general, the death of a queen, the death of a way of governing that would not return for 2 millennia. To reach Actium we have to reach a much older feud. When Julius Caesar was assassinated on the 15th of March in the year 44, his political inheritance was divided between 2 men, his 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted son, Gaius Octavius, later called Octavian, and his most capable general, Marcus Antonius, called in English Mark Antony. For 13 years they were, in name, allies. In fact, from the beginning, they were rivals. Antony took the eastern provinces, Greece, the Levant, Asia Minor, and, most importantly, an alliance with the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies. Octavian kept the west, Italy, Gaul, Spain, Africa. Between them lay a settlement that both of them, in their calmer moments, knew would not hold. The break came in the year 32. Antony formally divorced Octavian's sister Octavia. He had, by then, 3 children with Cleopatra, twins named after the sun and the moon, and a younger boy named Ptolemy Philadelphus. He was living, most of the year, in Alexandria. Octavian's response was calculated. He read Antony's will aloud in the Senate, a will Antony had deposited with the Vestal Virgins, and which Octavian had illegally seized. In the will, Antony directed that on his death his body should be buried not in Rome, but in Alexandria, next to Cleopatra. Octavian let the Senate imagine the rest. War was declared not on Antony but on Cleopatra, a foreign queen who had, they were told, seduced a Roman general and meant to make Rome a province of Egypt. For the whole spring and summer of 31, the 2 sides gathered forces in western Greece. Antony had 800 ships, including 170 Egyptian vessels from Cleopatra's own fleet. Many of his ships were enormous, the great 10s and 11s, ships with 10 or 11 banks of oars, floating platforms bristling with catapults. His army numbered perhaps 100,000 men. Octavian had roughly 400 ships, mostly smaller, faster Liburnian galleys of the type used in the Adriatic. But he had Agrippa. Agrippa had already, in the previous decade, defeated Sextus Pompey's fleet in Sicily using a mechanical grapnel he had invented himself called the Harpax. He had built his fleet on a lake near Naples and trained it for 2 years in secret. Antony's mistake, and every ancient historian who writes about the campaign agrees on this, was to allow his fleet to be pinned into the Gulf of Ambracia, a shallow enclosed body of water opening onto the Ionian Sea through a narrow strait less than a kilometer wide. Agrippa raided the coast up and down. He captured Antony's supply bases. He starved the harbor. By late summer, Antony's crews were sick with malaria. Deserters were slipping out at night. His generals were, one by one, going over to Octavian. The Roman senator Domitius Ahenobarbus, one of Antony's most respected officers, rowed across in a small boat and defected, and died 3 days later, according to Plutarch, of shame. On the 1st of September, in a council of war, Cleopatra pushed for what turned out to be a fateful decision. Antony's staff wanted to abandon the ships, march the army inland to Macedonia, and fight a land campaign. Cleopatra insisted the fleet must be saved. And so Antony gave the order that his ships should be loaded with their treasure and their sails, and that they should attempt a battle breakthrough, southward, into the open sea, on the following morning. The sails were the most important detail. A Roman warship of the classical period did not normally carry sails into battle. Sails were left ashore, so the ship could turn faster under or alone. To load the sails onto the ships was to signal, to every rower and every captain, that this was not a pure fight. This was an escape. The morning of the 2nd of September dawned calm. The two fleets rowed out, Agrippa's line to the northwest, Antony's forcing the mouth of the strait. For 4 hours, from mid-morning until early afternoon, the two lines held. Agrippa's smaller Liburnians tried to circle and ram the great Antonian tens. The tens tried to catch the Liburnians with grapnels and bring them close enough to board. The catapults on both sides flung firepots and stones. The Ionian Sea, that day, was the color of pale slate under a blue sky. Then, in the early afternoon, the wind rose from the northwest, a stern-quarter wind for anyone sailing south. Cleopatra's flagship, at the back of the Antonian line, hoisted its sail. Behind her, 60 other Egyptian ships did the same. They cut through a gap in the fighting where Antony's center had partially disengaged, and, running before the wind, they were gone. Antony, on his flagship, saw them. He gave a single order, transferred to a small 5-oared boat, and rowed after her. He caught up with Cleopatra's ship 2 hours later, went aboard, and, according to Plutarch, sat in the prow with his head in his hands, and did not speak to her for 3 days. The battle at the mouth of the strait continued for another hour after they left. The Antonian ships that remained fought bravely for a while and then, when it became clear their commander was gone, surrendered. Perhaps 5,000 men died in the fighting. Antony's land army, camped on the shore, watched the whole thing. When their generals proposed to march inland, the soldiers refused. Within a week they had all surrendered to Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra reached Alexandria in late September, 31. They had 10 months left. They spent them, according to Plutarch, in what he calls the society of the inimitable livers, a court of noblemen and noblewomen who dined together every night, dressed in gold, and swore they would die together. Antony sent envoys to Octavian offering to abdicate quietly if he could live in Athens. Octavian did not answer. Antony tried, briefly, to raise fresh troops in Cyrenaica. The garrison there mutinied and went over. He returned to Alexandria and drank. In early August, 30, Octavian's army entered Egypt from the east. Cleopatra retreated to her own mausoleum, a stone building she had constructed on the harbor front, with treasures piled in the upper chamber. Antony, told falsely that she had already killed herself, fell on his sword in the palace. He was still alive when a messenger arrived with the news that she was, in fact, in the mausoleum, and wanted to see him. His attendants carried him there in a litter. Because Cleopatra had barred the door and would not let anyone in, he was hauled up by ropes through the upper window. He died in her arms shortly afterwards. For a week after Antony's death, Cleopatra negotiated with Octavian. He wanted her alive, for the triumph in Rome. She wanted, she said, only to be allowed to bury Antony. She was permitted to. She dressed in her royal robes, put on the diadem, arranged herself on a golden couch, and, either by the bite of an Egyptian cobra concealed in a basket of figs, Plutarch's version, or by a poison she had tested for a year on condemned prisoners, Cassius Dio's version, she died alongside two of her waiting women. When the Roman guards broke in, she was already cold, on the couch, with one of her women arranging the diadem on her head with a shaking hand. The woman, according to Plutarch, said to the guards, "Yes, it is fitting. She was descended from so many kings." She was 39. She was the last pharaoh of an Egypt that had been governed by Egyptians and Greeks for 3,032 years. After her, Egypt would be governed from Rome, then from Constantinople, then from Damascus, then from Baghdad, then from Istanbul, then from London, never again from Alexandria. The three surviving children of Antony and Cleopatra, Alexander Aelios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome, walked in chains in Octavian's triumph in the year 29, and then, quietly, handed over to Octavia, the sister Antony had divorced, to raise. Selene, the daughter, was eventually married off to the king of Mauritania and lived out her life in North Africa. The two boys disappear from the record. Nobody quite knows what happened to them. Octavian returned to Rome, and in the year 27 before our era, the Senate voted him the name Augustus. He ruled for 41 years. When he died in 14 of our era, the Republic was a memory. The empire he had made would run for another 440 years in the West, and, in the East, in another form, for almost 1500. Today the Gulf of Ambracia is a quiet Greek estuary popular with fishermen. On the northern headland, at a place called Nicopolis, the city of Victory, founded by Octavian to commemorate the battle, the ruins of a memorial stand, a long stone base into which the bronze rams of 36 of Antony's captured warships were once bolted, in a display Octavian meant the world to see. The rams are gone, melted down centuries later. The sockets for them, in the stone, are still visible. There are more places like this waiting in the archive, kingdoms that ended in one afternoon, queens who ordered figs, empires born from a single September wind. Every night, another one. If you've enjoyed this story, you can subscribe. More like this, next week. Sleep well. On the evening of the 29th of May, in the year 323 before our era, in a palace room in the city of Babylon, a 32-year-old man who had, in 12 years of continuous marching, defeated the Persian Empire, crossed the Hindu Kush, invaded India, mutinied against his own troops, and had begun to plan the conquest of Arabia, sat down at a banquet, drank a very large cup of unmixed Chian wine, cried out suddenly as if he had been struck in the back, and was carried to his bed. 11 days later, he was dead. The banquet was hosted by a Thessalian officer named Medius of Larissa, an intimate of the king. The room, we think, was in the summer palace of Nebuchadnezzar in the northern quarter of the city, on the west bank of the Euphrates. There were about 20 men present. They stayed drinking through most of the night. What Alexander drank, then and over the next days, and what he ate, and what he did not eat, is described in some detail, with contradictions, in at least for ancient accounts, and by for more that no longer survive but that the surviving quote. For 2,500 years since, every historian who has read those accounts has arrived, by roughly day 4 of the fever, at the same question. What killed him? This is the story of those 11 days. And of the 6 leading theories: malaria, typhoid, alcoholic hepatitis, West Nile fever, poison, and, most recently, a paralysis so precisely reasoned that it may explain the strangest single feature of his death, the fact that, for 6 days after he stopped breathing, his body did not decompose. To reach the 11 days, we have to reach Babylon. Alexander arrived there in the spring of 323 from a long round of eastern travel, India, the Indus Delta, Carmania, Susa, Ecbatana, after almost losing his army in a desert crossing in Jedrosia, and after conducting, at Susa, a mass wedding of 90 of his officers to Persian noble women. His closest friend, Hephaestion, had died a few months earlier of an unexplained fever at Ecbatana, and Alexander had, by every account, not really recovered. He had had Hephaestion's doctor executed. He had shaved his hair in mourning. He had sent to the oracle of Ammon to ask whether Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. By the time he entered Babylon in early spring, the Chaldean priests, according to Arrian, met him at the gate and warned him not to enter the city facing west. He entered anyway. There were, they said, bad omens. A tame lion in the royal menagerie was kicked to death by a domestic ass. A man in a stranger's tunic sat on the empty royal throne one afternoon while Alexander was bathing. On being asked why he had done this, the man said he did not know. He was executed. The banquet with Medius was on the 18th day of the Babylonian month of Daisios, which, converted, is roughly the 29th of May. What happened after has to be reconstructed by comparing for sources against a document called the Royal Ephemeриdes, the daily court diary of the king, quoted directly in Arrian and Plutarch. The diary, if we trust it, reads like a medical chart. Day 1, the fever begins. He bathes and sleeps. Day 2, he bathes, offers the usual sacrifices, spends the day in his chamber, and calls in his generals to give sailing orders for the Arabian expedition scheduled for the 4th of the following month. Day 3, he continues to give orders, but is now moved out of his royal bedroom into a cooler chamber near the palace swimming pool, so that he can bathe more easily. Day 4, 5, 6, 7, the fever grows worse but he continues to receive officers and to speak. Day 8, he can no longer speak clearly. Day 9, the soldiers of the phalanx, hearing rumors he is dead, refuse to accept the news and demand to be allowed to see him. Alexander orders them let in. He cannot lift his hand, but he opens his eyes and moves his fingers, one by one, as they pass. The march of the phalanx through the room takes several hours. On day 10, he is silent. On the 11th day, in the evening, he stops breathing. That is the timeline. Now the theories. The oldest, and probably the strongest, is malaria. Babylon in the year 323 was surrounded by irrigation canals and marshes. The Anopheles mosquito was endemic. Falciparum malaria, the deadly strain, produces very high fevers, moves in cycles, causes progressive weakness, and can kill within 2 weeks. The pattern of Alexander's fever, moving up over 11 days rather than remitting cleanly, fits falciparum better than any other cause. It is the most parsimonious answer. It is what most historians for 2 centuries have believed. The second theory is typhoid. Typhoid, Salmonella typhi, is a waterborne bacterial infection that produces continuous fever, weakness, and, in about a fifth of untreated cases, an intestinal perforation that kills the patient after about 2 weeks. Alexander had almost certainly drunk poorly filtered river water on the marches. The abdominal complaints that Plutarch mentions, and the progressive weakness, fit typhoid. Against typhoid, the extreme rapidity of the mental deterioration is less characteristic. The third theory is West Nile fever. In 2003, an American pathologist named John Marr and an epidemiologist named Charles Kalischer published a paper in the journal Emerging Infectious Diseases pointing out that the omens described, the ravens falling out of the sky at Babylon, described by Plutarch, are also a symptom of a West Nile epidemic. Corvids are notoriously vulnerable to West Nile virus. If the ravens were dying, they argued, mosquitoes carrying the virus may have been feeding on Alexander. West Nile encephalitis matches the loss of speech and the progressive paralysis. It is a suggestive theory. It cannot be proved. The fourth theory is alcoholic hepatitis. Alexander was, by every account we have, a very heavy drinker. He had killed his friend Cletus in a drunken quarrel 5 years earlier. He drank most nights. He drank unmixed Chian wine at the Medius banquet, a thing considered barbaric by Greek standards. Cumulative alcoholic liver disease, punctuated by an acute binge, can produce the collapse Alexander suffered. Against it, the 11-day timeline is a little slow. The fifth theory, which the ancient sources themselves argue back and forth about, is poisoning. The mastermind, supposedly, was Antipater, Alexander's regent back in Macedonia, an old man Alexander had summoned to Babylon to answer for various administrative disputes, who had reason to think he would not survive the interview. According to Diodorus and Justin, Antipater sent his son Cassander to Babylon with a small quantity of a poison so cold, gathered from a spring of the river Styx in Arcadia, that it could only be carried in the hollow hoof of an ass. Cassander gave the poison to his brother Iolaus, who was Alexander's royal cupbearer. Iolaus dropped it in the wine. The story is dramatic. It has one serious problem: no poison known in antiquity produces exactly the 11-day timeline of a slowly rising fever. Strychnine, hellebore, and arsenic all act differently. Some pharmacologists have suggested a slow dose of white hellebore, which can produce a prolonged fatal cause, but the fit is imperfect. The sixth and most recent theory is the most disturbing. In the year 2018, an anaesthetist and lecturer in medicine at the University of Otago in New Zealand, Dr. Catherine Hall, published a paper in the Ancient History Bulletin proposing that Alexander died of Guillain-Barré syndrome, an autoimmune paralysis that begins in the feet, moves upward, and can, in its most severe form, paralyze the diaphragm and stop respiration while leaving the patient conscious. What made Hall look at the syndrome specifically was one detail in the ancient sources that has puzzled historians for 2,000 years, the fact that, according to Plutarch, Alexander's body did not decompose for 6 days after his apparent death. It sounds miraculous. It has been treated, over the centuries, as either legend or divine sign. Hall's argument is that it is neither. If Alexander was suffering from ascending paralysis, flaccid weakness moving up from the legs, silencing the voice, then the diaphragm, he might, on day 11, have become unresponsive, unable to breathe deeply enough to be visible, with a pulse too faint to detect using the medical methods of the ancient world. His companions might, in good faith, have declared him dead. And he might, for another 6 days, have been slowly dying rather than already dead. That would explain, perfectly, the intact body. It would also mean that Alexander the Great was buried alive. Which of the 6 theories is right, we cannot know for certain. The body, embalmed shortly after the presumed death, probably in the days when, if Hall is right, he was still alive, was carried in a golden carriage from Babylon towards Macedonia and, midway, hijacked by Ptolemy, taken to Alexandria, and set up in a great mausoleum called the Sema. There it lay for centuries. Julius Caesar visited it. Augustus visited it and, according to Suetonius, snapped off part of the mummy's nose by accident when he leaned in to kiss it. Caracalla visited it in the year 215 of our era. And then, sometime after that, the tomb was lost. It has never been found. Every so often, an Egyptian construction crew, digging in Alexandria, breaks into an unexpected chamber and, briefly, sets off the rumor again. So far, always, a false alarm. Somewhere under the modern streets of Alexandria, in an underground room the archaeologists have not yet reached, may lie the remains of a man who died in a room in Babylon, of a disease we cannot name, on a day in early June, 2,348 years ago. There are more stories like this waiting in the archive: kings who died at 32 and cannot be buried, tombs under modern streets, diseases whose names no ancient physician knew. Every night, another one. If you've enjoyed this story, you can subscribe. More like this, next week. Sleep well. In the summer of 1877, 3 merchants from the town of Kabadian, in what is now Tajikistan, arrived at the caravanserai of Rawalpindi in British India, having crossed the Hindu Kush with 2 mule-loads of gold. Roughly 180 separate objects, cups, plaques, a miniature 4-horse chariot the size of a hand, coins, rings, sword scabbards inlaid with garnet, none of the pieces less than 2,000 years old. Bandits on the last pass, in a place called the Kotal, tried to take the mules from them, and, in the middle of the fight, a British political officer named Colonel Burton happened to be riding by with a small escort. He drove off the bandits. The merchants, in gratitude, showed him the gold. He advised them to take it to India, and they did. Most of it was bought by Sir Augustus Wollaston Franks, keeper of British antiquities at the British Museum, in the 1880s. It is still on display today, in room 52. It is called the Oxus treasure, after the river the merchant said it came from, the Oxus, known now as the Amu Doria, which drains the northern face of the Hindu Kush and, for most of its length, forms the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. Where exactly the merchants dug it up, no one has ever found. The site is somewhere along the north bank of the river, in a stretch of dry loess country where the wind now blows over broken pottery. But what the treasure proves is that, 2,300 years ago, in this cold high country between the Iranian plateau and the deserts of Central Asia, a civilization existed that spoke Greek, wore Greek clothes, minted Greek coins with the profiles of Greek kings, and lived in Greek cities with theatres and gymnasia. And then, in the space of about a century, it disappeared. The country was called Bactria. This is its story. To reach Bactria, in the year 330 before our era, Alexander the Great crossed the Hindu Kush in winter, with an army that had already marched from Macedonia through Persia, and lost, in the passes, more men to frostbite and starvation than he had lost in any pitched battle. On the far side, he found a country of high plains, cold rivers, fortified rock citadels, and a population that fought him harder than any he had met before. He spent 2 years there. He married a Bactrian princess, Roxana. He founded, in the plains between the Oxus and the mountains, at least 6 cities, several of them called Alexandria. Then he marched on into India. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323, his empire came apart in 2 wars between his generals. Bactria fell, eventually, to the Seleucid dynasty, based in Syria, a Greek kingdom governing everything from the Aegean to the Indus. For about 80 years the Seleucid governors held Bactria as a distant frontier satrapy. And then, around 250 before our era, the governor, a man named Diodotus, did what governors on distant frontiers often do. He minted his own coins with his own face on them. He stopped answering letters from Ansh. He declared himself king. From that point Bactria was independent. Its coins are among the most beautiful of the ancient world. The portraits of the kings Euthydemus, Demetrius, Menander, Eucratides, and a dozen others, are so finely cut that individual muscles in the face are legible. The obverses show Greek gods, the reverses, on some issues, show the Buddha. The greatest of the coins is a 20-stater gold piece of King Eucratides, weighing almost 170 grams, the largest gold coin ever struck in antiquity anywhere. Only one example survives. It is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. For a long time, Bactria was known to Western historians only from these coins, and from a few paragraphs in classical writers, Strabo, Justin, Polybius, who mentioned the far country beyond the Oxus in vague and admiring tones. Strabo wrote that Bactria had 1,000 cities. No one believed him. He must, historians thought, be exaggerating. Then, in the summer of 1961, the king of Afghanistan, on a hunting trip in the far northeast of his country, near the confluence of the Kokcha and the Oxus, stopped for water at a village called Ari Khanum, the Lady of the Moon, in Uzbek. He noticed that the peasants, who were building a house nearby, had, in the walls of the house, small blocks of white marble carved with Greek letters. He mentioned this, on his return to Kabul, at a dinner, to Daniel Schlumberger, the head of the French archaeological delegation in Afghanistan. Schlumberger sent an assistant, Paul Bernard, in the spring of 1964. Bernard walked over the site, an L-shaped triangle of high ground where the two rivers meet, and, in the first afternoon, picked up a fragment of a Corinthian column capital and a piece of a stone slab inscribed, in classical Greek, with proverbs collected from the Oracle of Delphi. The proverbs, "Fear neither poverty nor death, know thyself, honor the gods," had been copied out at Delphi in the 4th century before our era by a certain Cleopatra, and carried, according to the inscription itself, to King Ace, the founder of the city. They had been brought, from the sanctuary of Apollo in central Greece, over 2,000 kilometers, to the far bank of the Oxus, so that a colony of Greeks living at the end of the world could see the words on the wall of their public square. Bernard and his team excavated Ari Khanum for the next 14 years. What they uncovered is one of the strangest sights in the archaeology of the ancient world. A Greek city, 3 kilometers long, with a citadel, a theater for 6,000 spectators, a gymnasium, the largest of the entire Hellenistic world, larger than the one at Priene, larger than the one at Miletus, a great palace with a Corinthian peristyle courtyard, a temple to Zeus and, side by side with it, a smaller temple with an indented plan closer to the Iranian and Zoroastrian tradition. Greek and Iranian, side by side. The coins in the excavation went from Seleucus I, in the years around 300, down to Eucratides I, and then stopped. They stopped in about 145 before our era. That year, we know from Chinese sources, the Han Dynasty court had by then begun sending diplomatic embassies westward to look for horses, and one of these embassies, led by Zhong Qian, arrived in the region around 130, that a nomadic people the Chinese called the Yuezhi, driven westward by another nomadic people called the Xiongnu, poured south across the Oxus. They took the country from the Greek kings. They burned Ari Khanum. The excavators found, in the ruins, the arrowheads of steppe nomads in the walls, and, in the treasury, the last coins of Eucratides scattered on the floor as the treasury officer had dropped them. The Greek kingdoms south of the Hindu Kush lingered on another century or so. Their kings continued to mint bilingual coins in Greek and in a North Indian script called Kharoshthi. Some converted to Buddhism. One of them, Menander, known in the Buddhist Pali texts as Milinda, had a philosophical dialogue with a monk named Nagasena, preserved in a long text called The Questions of Melinda, in which a Greek king asks, in a manner that would have been familiar to Socrates, whether the self is real. Menander was a Greek. He probably did not know a Greek city west of the Hindu Kush any longer, in his lifetime, that was still standing. By the year 0 of our common era, the Greek kingdom of Bactria was gone. What remained were the coins, buried in caches by owners who never came back for them, the ruins of the cities, blown over with loess and forgotten, the Buddha statues, from the school of Gandhara, whose robes fall in Greek folds and whose curls are combed like the curls of Apollo, and the memory, 3,000 kilometers away, of a river called the Oxus with cities on its banks that had once had Greek theaters. The archaeological site at Ari Khanum did not survive the 20th century. In 1978, at the end of the excavation season, the last French team packed up their finds and left for Kabul. Then came the Soviet invasion, then the Civil War, then the Taliban. When journalists finally got back to the site in the early 2000s, the excavated stones had been dug over by looters using bulldozers. The theater was gone. The gymnasium was pockmarked with pits. Fragments of the reliefs come up, occasionally, in the antiquities markets of Peshawar and Dubai. The Oxus treasure, in the British Museum, is safe. So are the small notebooks of Paul Bernard, in the archives of the Musée Guimet in Paris. Between them, they preserve, for now, What the Greek kingdom of the Hindu Kush was, a place where philosophers copied the maxims of Delphi onto stone in a courtyard where snow fell in winter, and where kings on horseback minted, out of the gold that came down the mountain rivers, the finest coin portraits ever struck in the ancient world. There are more places like this waiting in the archive: Greek cities in the Afghan mountains, gold from a river no one visits anymore, kingdoms that lasted 2 centuries and then blew away with the Lurs. Every night, another one. If you've enjoyed this story, you can subscribe. More like this, next week. Sleep well. On a wet grey morning in the autumn of the year 9 of our era, in a bog of black mud somewhere between 2 low hills in what is now the North German state of Lower Saxony, 20,000 Roman soldiers walked into the trees, and none of them walked out again. 6 years later, when the first Roman scouts finally found the place, the leg bones of the horses were still standing upright in the mud where they had sunk, and the skulls of the men were nailed to the oak trees. The disaster is called, in every Roman source that survives, the Clades Variana, the Varian catastrophe, named after the general who lost the legions. Its Latin name, 3 words, was spoken in Rome for 4 centuries as a synonym for utter ruin. Augustus himself, the emperor, according to Suetonius, stopped shaving. He beat his head against the doorposts of his palace. He cried out, in the night, Quintili ver, legions red, Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions. The legions were 3, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th. None of the 3 names was ever used again by Rome. The numbers themselves were considered unlucky. For 2,000 years, no Roman legion, and no later regiment tracing Roman lineage, carried a 17th, an 18th, or a 19th. This is the story of how the legions were lost. And of how, in the summer of 1987, a British Army major with a metal detector, on holiday in Germany, found the field where they died. To understand what happened in the forest, we have to understand what Rome thought it was doing on the far side of the Rhine. By the year 9, Augustus was 71 years old and had ruled for 4 decades. He had, in that time, expanded Roman power to the Danube, the Rhine, the Sahara, and the Euphrates. On the northern frontier, his stepson Drusus, and later his stepson Tiberius, had pushed the border forward through Germania, the vast belt of forest and marsh between the Rhine and the Elbe, and, by roughly the year 6, most of the tribes between those 2 rivers had submitted. Roman roads were being cut. Roman toll stations were collecting duties. Roman law was being taught in makeshift courts. Augustus considered the country pacified. He sent out a governor to make it a province. The governor's name was Publius Quinctilius Varus. He was 53 years old. He was married into the imperial family. His wife was a great-niece of Augustus. He had governed Syria, where he had brutally put down a Jewish revolt after the death of Herod the Great. Varus was not stupid. He was thorough. He was a lawyer. He believed that a country was governed by giving orders in Latin, collecting taxes, and hanging the men who disagreed. In Germania, this belief was about to kill him. Because Germania was not Syria. There were no cities. There were no roads that a Roman would have called a road. There were tracks, through the woods, where 2 men could walk abreast if they stooped. There were bogs where a hobnailed sandal would sink to the ankle at the first step. And the trees themselves, in the region north of the Weser River, grew in continuous forest, oak and beech, with almost no undergrowth in some places and impenetrable thickets of alder in others. The forest reduced visibility to a few meters. It muffled sound. It removed, for a Roman column trained to fight in open field formation, every advantage it had. Among Varus's staff was a young officer of the imperial cavalry auxiliaries, a man in his mid-20s, who spoke fluent Latin, held Roman citizenship, and had commanded a squadron in an earlier campaign. His name, in Latin, was Arminius. In his own language, we think it was something close to ermine. He was a nobleman of the Cherusei, the tribe whose territory lay between the Weser and the Upper Ems. He had been sent to Rome as a hostage of good conduct in his teens. He had been trained there. He knew, from the inside, exactly how a Roman army marched, camped, and fought. He also knew that his people, and the neighboring tribes, did not consider themselves pacified. They considered themselves waiting. In the late summer of the year 9, Arminius came to Varus with a report. A minor tribe on the eastern edge of the pacified zone, he said, was in revolt. Nothing serious. But the governor should march his 3 legions, on the way back from summer camp to the Rhine winter quarters, slightly off the usual route, through the country of the Cherusei, and put the rebellion down. Varus agreed. It was a small detour. And Arminius, after all, had been an officer with him for months. Varus set out with his 3 legions, 6 auxiliary cohorts, 3 cavalry wings, perhaps 20,000 fighting men, and, dragging along behind, an enormous train of wives, slaves, wagons, cattle, and camp followers. The column, when it stretched itself out on the march, was more than 15 kilometers long. Arminius rode ahead with his own cavalry, saying he was going to raise local levies to join them. He did not come back. What he did instead, during those 3 days, was seal a coalition that no one on the Roman side seems to have suspected was possible. The Cherusei, the Bactria, the Marsi, the Chatti, the Sicambri, and a dozen smaller peoples, men who had spent generations fighting each other over cattle and fords, had agreed, in secret, to fall on Varus together. The first blow came on a narrow track in a rising wind, in the afternoon of the 2nd day of the diversion. Roman scouts died first. Then the baggage train was hit. Then, from both sides of the track, out of the trees, came the German warbands, long javelins in the first shower, then short spears, then swords. The Romans could not form a proper line. They could not use their catapults, which were still on the wagons. They could not, in many places, even lock shields, because there was no room between the trunks. They tried, on the first evening, to build a marching camp, the standard Roman answer to every crisis. They dug a ditch. They set up a palisade. Inside the ditch, that night, in the rain, they burned every wagon and every cart that would slow them the next morning. Then, at dawn, they left the camp and tried to fight their way west, towards the Rhine. The 2nd day was worse than the first. The rain was continuous. The bows of the auxiliary archers slackened in the wet. The Roman shields, laminated wood, absorbed water until a legionary could barely lift his. The narrow track between the woods and a rising bog forced the column into a line 1 man wide in places. The Germans, on higher ground on one side and behind a low earthen rampart they had built for the purpose on the other, poured spears down for hour after hour after hour. On the 3rd day, the survivors reached a defile between a wooded hill on their left and a great swamp on their right. This is the ground the archaeologists would, one day, call Calcarees. The Germans had, before the Romans ever left camp, built a long wall of turf and timber, some 400 meters long and 1.5 meters high, along the base of the hill. From behind this wall they threw spears down onto the column. There was nowhere to go. The swamp on the right could not be crossed in armor. The wall could not be climbed under continuous fire. The forest above the wall was full of men. The column disintegrated. Varus, wounded in the fighting, fell on his sword. His senior officers followed. His body was later dug up by the Germans, decapitated, and his head sent as a diplomatic gift to the king of the Marcomanni, who, to his credit, sent it on to Augustus for a proper burial. The men who survived the 3rd day were hunted through the woods for another 2 days. A few hundred, by some accounts, made it back to the Rhine. The rest were killed on the tracks or captured. The prisoners, according to Tacitus, were led to sacred groves, the Roman officers were sacrificed on altars to the German gods, the ordinary soldiers were kept as slaves. The legionary standards, the sacred eagles of the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were carried into the woods and hidden. Rome would recover them, painfully, over the next 30 years. And that was the frontier settled. Augustus, in the shock of the news, briefly considered abandoning the whole of Gaul. He didn't, but he abandoned everything east of the Rhine. His successor Tiberius, in the year 15 and 16 of our era, sent the general Germanicus back into the forest with 8 legions. Germanicus found the battlefield. Tacitus, writing a century later, tells us what they saw: white bones in heaps in the open where men had died standing, bones in fragments where they had run, helmets nailed to the trees, horselines picked clean by wolves, and, in the middle of a clearing, 3 low altars, and the skulls of the tribunes on them. Germanicus and his men buried what they could. Then they marched away. Rome never seriously tried to hold Germania again. The Rhine remained the frontier for another 400 years. The forest kept it secret for 18 centuries. Then, in 1987, a British Army major named Tony Clun, stationed with the British Army of the Rhine and interested in Roman history, walked with permission across a farmer's field at a place called Calcrease, near the modern town of Bramsch, north of Osnabrück. He was carrying a metal detector. In the first afternoon he found 3 lead sling bullets of a type used only by Roman auxiliaries between the years 15 before our era and roughly 15 of our era. Over the next weeks he found Roman silver coins, all struck before the year 9, none struck after. Not one coin was later. Something had happened in that field, before the reign of Tiberius, and that something had prevented the ordinary drift of coin traffic across the region for the rest of the century. A full archaeological excavation began in 1989 and has continued for more than 30 years since. The excavators have found the earth and turf wall, half a kilometer of it. They have found spearheads embedded in it from the German side, and Roman iron nails from the Roman marching sandals scattered thickly on the track below it. They have found sword hilts, dagger sheaths, cavalry face masks. They have found, in the pits behind the wall, the mass graves of Roman soldiers, the bones showing weapon cuts and, in some cases, the sword marks of ritual execution. They have found the buckle of a centurion engraved with his name and the number of his legion. The number is the 19th. Today, at Calcrease, a modern museum stands on the field. It has a low iron tower that visitors climb, from which they can look down over the meadow to the low ridge in the north. It is a very quiet place. Farmers plow the surrounding fields. Sheep graze on the reconstructed wall. In autumn, the beech trees turn copper, and it is possible to walk out onto the meadow at dusk, when the light goes flat, and feel, for a moment, walking under the trees, how a column of tired men would have felt in the rain, hearing the first spears come out of the woods. There are more places like this waiting in the archive. Battlefields turned to farmland, empires stopped at a tree line, whole legions gone silent under the moss. Every night, another one. If you've enjoyed this story, you can subscribe. More like this, next week. Sleep well.
The pharmacist did not know what he was looking at. It was sometime in the 1890s in a shop in Anyang, a city in the northern Chinese province of Hunan. The pharmacist, the details of his identity are blurred by time and competing accounts, was examining a shipment of what his suppliers called dragon bones. Dragon bones were a traditional ingredient in Chinese medicine, ground to powder and prescribed for ailments ranging from malaria to knife wounds. They were, in reality, old bones and shells, dug from the earth and sold through intermediaries. The market for them was active and entirely unquestioning about their origins. These particular bones were different. covered in fine scratches. Not the random marks of soil pressure or root growth, but regular, deliberate patterns. Rows of small carved symbols, dense and intricate. The pharmacist looked more closely. The symbols were writing. Very old writing, nothing like the Chinese characters he knew, but structured in the same way, with the same internal logic of stroke and form. He paid for the bones and did not grind them. What he held in his hands was the oldest writing ever found in China. The script of a dynasty that many educated Chinese people of his era did not fully believe had ever existed. The Shang dynasty is one of the earliest periods of Chinese history for which we have both archaeological evidence and written records. It is conventionally dated from roughly 1600 BCE to 1046 BCE, though those dates are debated. The Shang ruled the Yellow River Plain in what is now northern and central China, a region of loess soil and seasonal floods. Where millet and rice grew in the bottomlands and bronze was cast in furnaces that reached temperatures previously unknown in that part of the world. Later Chinese historical traditions, especially those compiled during the Zhou dynasty that followed the Shang, remembered the Shang kings as real but somewhat legendary figures, ancestors of the Shang's royal house, presiders over an elaborate court, commanders of armies that fought against rival states and nomadic peoples on the frontiers. The grand historian Sima Qian, writing in the 2nd century BCE, listed the names of all 31 Shang kings in the correct order. For a long time, modern scholars were not sure whether to believe him. The Shang felt, in the absence of direct evidence, more like legend than history. The oracle bones changed that. They provided, in the words of the scholar David Cately, the earliest body of texts from East Asia. They recorded the names of kings, the dates of their reigns, the names of their consorts, their military campaigns, their religious practices. The king list that Sima Qian had compiled 2,000 years earlier turned out, when checked against the oracle bone inscriptions, to be almost entirely accurate. The Shang were real and they kept records. The oracle bones, the name given to them by modern scholars, are pieces of cattle scapula and turtle plastron, the flat underside of the turtle's shell. The plastron was preferred. It was large, flat, and smooth, providing a good surface for carving. The scapulae of cattle were also used, though they required more preparation. The ritual that produced the inscriptions was called pyromancy, divination by fire. A diviner, acting on behalf of the Shang king or under his direct supervision, would take a prepared bone or shell, use a bronze or stone tool to drill a series of oval pits into the back surface. Thin spots in the material, carefully calibrated, and then apply a heated bronze rod to each pit. The heat would cause the bone or shell to crack, producing a pattern of lines on the face of the material. The diviner would read the cracks. A straight crack was propitious, a curved crack was not, and announce the result. After the reading, the question, the crack, and often the outcome were carved into the surface in the script that the pharmacist in Anyang would later find inexplicable and beautiful. The script itself is the ancestor of modern Chinese writing. It is not identical to modern characters, but the structural logic is the same, a combination of pictographic, ideographic, and phonetic elements, each character encoding both meaning and sound. Some Shang characters are immediately recognizable. The character for sun is a circle with a dot inside. The character for mountain is 3 vertical peaks. The character for rain is dots falling from a horizontal line. Others require specialist training. The complete corpus of oracle bone characters contains roughly 4,000 distinct graphs, of which perhaps half have been reliably identified and translated. What did the Shang ask their oracle bones? Almost everything. Will it rain in the next 10 days? Will the harvest be good this season? Should the king go hunting in the eastern valley this week, or the western one? Will Lady How give birth safely? Is the illness of the king's tooth the fault of the royal ancestor Fu Yi, or some other spirit? Should we launch a military campaign against the Fang people on the northern frontier, and if so, when? The questions are remarkably mundane alongside the remarkable. Military strategy appears beside toothache. Questions about the weather appear beside questions about the proper conduct of ancestral sacrifice. The Shang king's world, as revealed by the oracle bones, was one in which the ancestors were constantly present, not as vague spirits but as specific, named individuals with moods and preferences and the capacity to cause harm if not properly attended to. The ancestors were consulted through the cracks because the cracks were a medium of communication, a way of making the invisible visible. The Shang believed, as Kately argued throughout his career, that the royal ancestors existed in a spirit world that mirrored the living world, and that they required the same things the living required: food, drink, attention, respect, and the performance of correct ritual. The oracle bones were, in this sense, administrative records of a bureaucracy that included the dead. The oracle bones have given us specific individuals. The most vivid is Fu Hao, or Lady Hao, a consort of the Shang king Wu Ding, who reigned somewhere around 1200 BCE. She appears in dozens of oracle bone inscriptions, and her tomb, excavated intact at Anyang in 1976, the only undisturbed Shang royal tomb ever found, filled in the details. The oracle bones record the king asking the bones, "Will Fu Hao's childbirth be good?" They record military campaigns that she commanded. She led armies of 13,000 soldiers, a figure so large that scholars initially doubted it. They record questions about her health, her rituals, the offerings to be made on her behalf. They record her death and the rituals performed to install her among the royal ancestors. Her tomb contained more than 1,600 bronze vessels, jade objects, bone artifacts, and ivory carvings. 68 individuals, likely retainers sacrificed to accompany her, were buried with her. The scale of her interment matches the scale of her presence in the oracle bone record. She was not a minor figure. She was, by the evidence of the bones and the tomb combined, one of the most powerful individuals of her era. The oracle bones, in this way, are not just administrative records. They are portraits, however fragmented, of specific people asking specific questions in specific moments of fear or uncertainty or hope. The bones the pharmacist found made their way, in the years following, to a wider audience. A scholar named Liu Yi, a novelist as well as an antiquarian, purchased a large collection and published rubbings of the inscriptions in 1903. It was the first academic publication of the oracle bone script. Scholars across China recognized immediately that the script was archaic Chinese, ancestral to the writing they knew. The excitement was considerable. The question of where the bones came from was, at first, answered evasively by the dealers. They knew that the source of a discovery was information to be sold, not shared. But the scholarly demand was insistent, and by the early 1900s, the location, the fields outside Anyang, on the banks of the Huan River, was widely known. Peasants had been finding the bones for decades, selling them to apothecaries, not knowing they were selling the archive of a dynasty. Systematic excavation began in 1928, under the Academia Sinica of the Republic of China. It was the first large-scale, scientifically conducted archaeological excavation in Chinese history. The director, Li Ji, insisted on stratigraphic recording, precise documentation, and the retention of objects that antiquities dealers would have discarded as worthless. Under 15 seasons of excavation between 1928 and 1937, the team uncovered bronze vessels, jade, bone artifacts, human and animal sacrificial remains, architecture, and tens of thousands more oracle bones. The Japanese invasion of 1937 ended the excavations. The discoveries were crated and moved south, ahead of the advancing army. Eventually, after years of wartime displacement, they made their way to Taiwan, where the National Palace Museum now holds the largest collection of oracle bones in the world. Excavations at Anyang resumed after 1949 and have continued, with interruptions, to the present day. The site is now a UNESCO World Heritage Area. The oracle bones are still being found. Before the oracle bones, the Shang dynasty was a tradition, an account in later texts, something that might or might not have happened. After the oracle bones, the Shang dynasty was a civilization, documented in its own hand. A civilization with specific kings whose names could be checked against the historical record, specific military campaigns whose dates could be debated, specific religious practices whose logic could be analyzed. The discovery extended the documented history of Chinese writing by roughly 1,000 years. It confirmed that Chinese civilization's roots were as deep as any in the world. And it revealed a world of belief in the power of the royal ancestors, in the communicability of the spirit world through cracks in bone, that was sophisticated and internally coherent, and that has no exact parallel anywhere else. Kately spent his career arguing that the oracle bone ritual was not primitive superstition but a highly developed technology of governance. The Shang king, through the oracle bones, was constructing and reinforcing his authority, demonstrating in the act of consultation that he had access to the ancestors and they to him, that the decision to go to war or plant crops or hold a ceremony was not his alone but was endorsed by the accumulated power of the royal line stretching back into the spirit world. In this reading, the oracle bones are not just records. They are performances. The cracking of the bone was a public act. The carving of the inscription was a public act. The presence of the ancestors was being made visible, and the king was its medium. There is something quietly astonishing about the oracle bone inscriptions that is easy to miss in the scholarly analysis. These were questions. The Shang king, the most powerful person in his world, commander of armies, custodian of the royal ancestors, the axis around which Bronze Age China turned, did not know. He did not know if it would rain. He did not know if the harvest would come. He did not know if his consort would survive childbirth. He did not know whether the pain in his tooth was punishment for some neglected ritual, or simply the inevitable failure of a body. He asked. He heated the rod, applied it to the pit in the bone, watched the crack form and asked. In a small clay-walled building beside the Yellow River, 3,000 years ago, someone took a turtle shell and a heated bronze rod and posed a question to the silence, and someone else, a diviner trained in reading cracks, looked at the result and announced an answer, and someone else, or perhaps the same person, carved the whole exchange into the surface of the shell in a script of precise and intricate characters, and stored the shell in a pit, and the pit was covered, and the river shifted, and the dynasty fell, and the script was forgotten, and the centuries turned, and the earth moved, and a pharmacist in Anyang picked up what he thought was a dragon bone and looked at the marks on its surface and did not grind it. The question survived. The answer is still being read. If you've enjoyed this story, you can subscribe. More like this next week. Sleep well.